Thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation and your too nice comment. So, oneself as another, or oneself as another one. First, maybe I allude to the relationships, many relationships between oneself and others, the others that inhabit us. Sirius Twet in The Shaking Woman says that the subjective world is an intersubjective world, the world of I and you, and to draw a line between both is difficult because others are part of us. There is also the other which reveals us, and Paul Ricoeur, from which I borrowed the title, said that the shortest road from self to self goes through the other. And there is the other, or the others, that we also are. And Claude Ameisen, in a beautiful letter which is called Letter on the Power of Writing, said that to write, let's forget to write, one has to disengage from self in order to become oneself, which means in order to recognize and to give birth to the other that we also are. And I think among the many topics of neuroscience and neurology and psychology, memory is one of the topics which speaks about the relationship between us becoming other, and the fact that identity on some level is never ceasing to become another. If we remember something that happened to us, it's because the thing that happened to us has changed something in ourselves, including in the networks of neurons, of brain cells in some regions. And so if we remember something that happened to us, it means that we changed when it happened to us, which means we are not the same as we were when it happened. So in some way, to be able to remember what I was, I'm becoming somebody else, another one that will remember about another one that I was in the past. So I think it's one of the topics. Empathy, sympathy, regrets, fear are other topics where the other will be in us in other way, really the other as the other and not only as part of us, like in memory. And François Cheng, in a beautiful book which is called 5 Meditations on Beauty, said that what a French Chinese philosopher and artist and poet said, that what happens between two people is as important as these two people. And it's not only as important as these two people, but it's as important for them that what they are and that the relationship is changing. And so one of the first questions is maybe how, when looking at the brain, when looking at the body, we can take into account this complex relation between us and others or other, and how we can do it knowing that observing, not only in quantum physics, observing is modifying. Observing is a kind of relationship which changes the behavior. And so the question is, we have to take into account when we observe, unless we spy, which raise other ethical questions, the fact that what we observe is changed by the fact that we are observing these complex processes. But I think the main topic in my mind is when we go from bench to clinics. When we are on the bench, in the lab, looking at imagery or doing experiments, we look at oneself and at the other as objects of studies. And we look for regularities, patterns, invariant relationships, causal relationships. And then what we learn and what we learn to do, which might help at the clinic, is put to the service of somebody which is a subject, an actor of his or her life. And this changes the relationship that we or that you have with the other and the other one. And in a beautiful book which is called I and You, the philosopher Martin Buber said that one of the, in his mind, main ethical questions pertains to the fact that science, when it studies us and not only stars or trees, studies us as he or she or this or that, and that we live each other as an I that says you, that waits for the other to say you, and to build together an us. And so he said that one of the ethical problems that science raised was how to use what we learn about us and others as he, she, that, or this, to put it to the service of the I, the you, and the us. And I think in this sense, what Paul Ricoeur was saying, that considering oneself as another or as another one is not the same as considering the other as another myself. It's even different from what Ben Okri, the same year as Paul Ricoeur, published his book, in a beautiful book which is called A Way to Being Free, A Way of Being Free, said, when he said that the other is myself as a stranger. What Paul Ricoeur is saying is, in oneself as another, there is no me, there is no myself, which means that the other is on the same par as the one. And because they are on the same par, it postulates that the other can also say me or I. And this, says Paul Ricoeur, leads to reciprocity, in which both which are engaged in reciprocity cannot be substituted one for the other. And one of the problems, how can we consider others or another one not as substitutes or projections of ourselves, but as others that, as ourselves, can say I and you and project on the other. There are situations when the other can be seen as absent, as completely lacking. One of these situations a long time ago was, for example, locked-in syndrome. Because people, an interesting fact is when we don't speak, and beyond the fact that we speak, as you know, we interpret, without even knowing it, the feelings, the intentions, the emotions of others by the way their muscle function. By the way, speaking is also a motor activity. So if somebody doesn't move his face, doesn't move his body, the person is expressing nothing in our eyes. And so people which were completely paralyzed, but which had complete mental capacity, were considered as having no inner life, no capacity of thinking, thinking I, because they didn't have any motor activity. There are other circumstances, and this is an extreme one, where people have expressions, but where it is thought, it was thought for a long time, that they didn't really have an I. Oliver Sacks, the neurologist and writer, wrote a few years after it was published, wrote that in 1986, a book was published that was unprecedented, extraordinary, and on some level, he said, unthinkable. And this book was the book by Temple Grandin, which was Emergence Labeled Autistic. So Oliver Sacks said it was unprecedented because nobody with autism had ever expressed itself. It was unthinkable almost because there was the idea that there was no self in autism. And it was extraordinary because he said it showed with striking clarity that very strange inner life, very strange subjectivity can exist that we could not imagine if we didn't come into contact with it. And so I think that to consider another as oneself, narration, the fact of being able to hear the person, whatever the person says and however the person is expressing it, may be central in our appreciation of what the person is. Sometimes, and Oliver Sacks is an example, there are others, a physician can allow people to express themselves, which is not exactly the same when I'm telling what somebody told me. It's not the same as listening to what somebody is saying. Oneself as another, there is something which I find humorous. You know that Oliver Sacks published a book which was called An Anthropologist on Mars, on the planet Mars, which has a chapter with this title, which is the encounter between Oliver Sacks and Temple Grandin. In French, for anthropologist, we have two words, one for a he anthropologist and one for a she anthropologist. Now, the title of the French translation is a he anthropologist on Mars. Like it would be obvious that Oliver Sacks, a physician, is the anthropologist looking for strange other ones. The irony is that the title of the chapter is referring to the fact that Temple Grandin is telling to Oliver Sacks, when I was a child and I looked at all this strange child around me, which made gestures and face expression which I didn't have any idea what it meant, I felt like an anthropologist on Mars. So the anthropologist on Mars from the title is Temple Grandin, is a she. And it's interesting because it means that for her, we were the other as oneself. And it's not so, this reciprocity is included in the title. So I think listening to what people can express about themselves is one way, maybe the privileged way of recognizing them as the equivalent of ourselves, of oneself. And there are the book of Temple Grandin, there are the very beautiful book of Daniel Tammet, which has a poetry in where Temple Grandin has a very great acuity. Tammet has a poetry, you know, the book Born on a Blue Day. I was born on a Wednesday. I know it's a Wednesday because the date is blue, and all the Wednesdays in my mind are blue, like the number 9 and the sound of loud voices which are quarreling. So it's a world where when he's trying to understand that some of his friends or somebody is having an emotional problem, he's thinking about numbers, because for him numbers have emotions, and so numbers help him to incarnate emotions from people. Sometimes, which is interesting, I think, which is another level, it's when a physician, a neurologist, speaks about him as a patient. So he's speaking about oneself and about as another. And Oliver Sacks did it in some of his books, standing on one leg when he doesn't feel a leg after an accident, and he thinks it's really strange to be in a situation where my leg does not appear to belong to me. What does identity and belonging of my parts to me really mean? And in the mind's eye, when he's discussing the fact that he doesn't recognize faces since he's a child, and more recently in the New York reviews of book, when he's speaking, he's having a treatment for his liver metastasis of an eye melanoma, and he reflects about homeostasis and the role of the autonomic nervous system by the effect of the treatment on his emotions, his feelings, and his fatigue. So it's interesting because there is the look of the other from the physician point of view, and the look from the self from the patient or person point of view. Something I was making a reference to The Shaking Woman by Sirius Tvet is a very nice example of somebody which is not a physician, but which becomes knowledgeable about neuroscience, psychiatry, neurology, psychoanalysis, and integrates philosophy and literature in her quest about what is happening to her. And it's a journey, and I allude to it, but this journey begins by the fact that he says the shaking woman, she's shaking when she's giving talks. The shaking woman is not, for me, it's not me, it's another, it's a stranger without a name. So it's not this frontier, that blur that I evoke, it's really a frontier. Who is the self? The other one or myself? And the journey will be a journey to reappropriate what is happening to her as part of what she is. And the end of the book is, one day I stood up and spoke about my father, which had died a few years before. I began to shake. I shook this day and I shook on other days. I am the shaking woman. So she's become. Temple Grandin says something similar. She says, autism is part of me. One of the most moving books which I know in the domain of neurology and psychiatry is a book by Kay Redfield Jamison, An Unquiet Mind, a memoir of moods and madness. And as you know or may know, Kay Redfield Jamison was one or the foremost specialist on bipolar disease, professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, despite the fact that she was not a physician, but a clinical psychologist. And she revealed 20 years ago that since her teenage, she had severe bipolar disease. So she was writing textbooks about bipolar disease. She was teaching and treating people which had the same disease as she had. And she was, in addition, in a particular situation of not telling anyone that she had the disease that she had to treat, except her colleagues, if something was happening that they could replace her. And so she spoke about this disease, and what is interesting is that she says that she asked at one part, if I would have been given the choice, would I have chosen to have bipolar disease or chosen not to have it? And I'll allude to it a little bit later, but she says that if there was no lithium, if there was no possibility of treatment, she would choose not to have it. But because there is lithium, she prefers to have it because she has lived a life that she feels is more intense, more deep, more emotionally enriched than most other lives. And so she decides, she took a very long time before accepting to get treated, but she decides to take lithium, but at suboptimal doses, so she can feel the way she is and not be plunged in deep depression or suicidal thoughts or delirium. And so it's seen not only from the patient and physician, but it's also seen from the therapeutic way. What does it mean to treat? And what does it mean to treat another one when she's thinking about treating herself? Now, Paul Ricoeur, if I go back to Paul Ricoeur said that identity is narrative, that it's only by narrating inside or by speaking that we can reconstruct a meaning about what happened, apparently sometimes in incoherent way. And so to speak is not to recall an identity, it's to build an identity. And Ricoeur says that this narrative identity is always changing, always destabilizing itself, which means that we evolve, that we emerge, that we change. And so the question is, in neurological disorders, psychiatric disorders, more than in other disorders, where the mental world, where the sense of identity is perturbed, how to be able to help somebody in addition or despite, in addition to treatment or despite the impossibility to treat, to reappropriate what happens to the person and to make sense of it. And one way, there has been in Nature 3 months ago a recension of theater, a piece of theater by a woman, Laura Jane Dean, which has obsessive compulsive disorder, and which wrote 2 theater pieces, one which is called, I think, Head, Hand, Head, and one when she began to get treatment, cognitive psychological treatment, which is called This Room. And she, during the elaboration, a little bit like Sirius Tvet, during the elaboration of her treatment, she went to Cambridge University, to Tom Robbins, to learn about neuroscience and neurology of her disorder. And she integrated it in her theater piece, saying what I wanted to speak about is what we know about the disorder, but what I wanted to speak is what I feel and what I think about this disorder. And so theater is in some ways a way of narration which goes beyond the classical narration on paper or face-to-face, which gives some distance. And there is in Europe, maybe in the States also, something which has been built by several physicians. André Grimaldi is one of them, a diabetologist, but other in other countries, in France, with professional theaters, and where it's proposed to patients to write, like a theater play, what they have experienced, how what they have experienced had profoundly shaken their life. They write it, and then professional directors help them to direct with professional actors the play. And then the third step is they are spectator of the play. So they are writers, directors, and spectators. So it's a journey, and it is so that this journey allows the change in the narrative identity, which allows a reappropriation of what has happened. So it's true in diabetes or other diseases, because it's a profound perturbation of, it's true in cancer, but I think that in neurological disorders, it raises other question, which is, how do we allow people which are perturbed in their mental representation to appropriate themselves and to construct an identity? And there is something which goes with this, which is free choice. If we go in the medical practice, how is free and informed choice built if people have restriction in autonomy, in rationality, or in mental representation? And I think there are 2 ways to see free and informed choice. One is to, in some ways, and it's true for children as well as for psychiatric and neurological patients, one is to measure how autonomous people are mentally, and to say they can decide or they cannot decide. So, in fact, it's binary. They are treated as subjects, and another as oneself, or they are treated for the good as objects, which means we decide for them because they are not able to decide. And I think there is often the fact which is not seen, which is that the process of free and informed choice, which in fact is a process of appropriation of what is happening to oneself, is in itself a process which enlarges autonomy. So the more you choose and the more you are able to reflect on what you want, and the more you become autonomous. And so I think the free and informed choice in patients which have altered mental capacity should be seen both as something that should be followed, it's the first case, and something that should be encouraged because in itself the process has something which has some healing power in the fact that of the appropriation. So the question is how to concile both, which means to use the process, even if at the end the choice will be balanced by what physician or others think should be help to the person which is not completely able to build it. The other question is, when we know how to do a thing, how to alleviate a problem, how do we decide what we do? And I come back to Kay Redfield Jamison. How in the dialogue between oneself and another can we mitigate what we can do and think is obligatorily good for the person, and how can this be built? It can be built in dialogue and free and informed choice, but it can be built, I think, also more collectively, with patients' association, with ethical committees or instances which have a broad transdisciplinary eye and way to look at things. But more broadly, maybe it should be built by societal reflection, which means how to use for the best of the people and for singular people what we are happy to have gained as knowledge and as power of transformation. Another point which I think is related to oneself and the other is that I think that in a lot of domains, at least in our country, but maybe also in neuroscience, neurology and psychiatry, something is often overlooked, which the WHO calls the social determinants of health. And social determinants of health are also social determinants of mental health. And what we can see in the brain or the body is not what in relationship to others will imprint itself years later in the brain and the body. So looking only inside the person or the behavior of the person might obscure the problems in the relation or the social building of the group or society where the person belongs that will impact his or her mental or psychological functioning. There are works by Michael Marmot several years ago, which, in addition to its Whitehall studies, the studies that showed years ago that if you go in English administrations, and I don't think that English administration has something which is very peculiar compared to other administrations, nobody is very, very rich at the top, and nobody is very, very poor at the bottom. But when you go along this administration, when you go down the hierarchical level, you go down the mean life expectancy. And when you remove what they did, factors which are related to the way of life, hypertension, obesity, drinking, smoking, it holds. So the question is, there is something in the way people are working and their social environment is constructed that appears, it's correlation, it's not causality, that appears to be correlated with a shortening of life expectancy years or decades later. At least at the correlation level, one of the big problems, which is the loss of cognitive functions with age, may be related to factors which are socially or personally built and which will impact the functioning of the brain decades later. Now, this is correlation, as you know, in mice, which may be different from humans, but which have some relationships. Enriched environment experiments have produced very potent results. So if mice, the simplest is if you take old mice and you allow them to have a nice activity, nice environment, to run in a wheel, to have objects which are changed regularly, sometimes to put the nourishment in a labyrinth, so they have to exert their memory to eat. They get memory capacities and capacity to engrain memory, which are the same as younger mice. And in fact, the renewal of the neural cells in their hippocampus is increased. So this is just activity preventing memory loss for some time. But several experiments have shown that if you induce experimentally neurodegenerative diseases, either through genetic, transgenic mice, or by inducing lesions, if you provide enriched environment, you can delay or prevent the onset of the disease with two settings which I find interesting. Either the onset of the lesions is prevented, so it's no mystery, there are no lesions, so the mice is well, or the lesions are similar to the lesions in the mice which are in a normal so-called environment, but the disease is not happening, which means something is dissociating the lesions from the expression, from the threshold in which there are manifestations of the disease. And so it's interesting because we have correlations in humans. We have causal relationships between richness of environment in mice. And so the question of mental function, memory, neurodegenerative diseases, loss of cognitive function, not as a purely biological phenomenon, but as a biological phenomenon constructed by the way we build our lives together, is something which I think is important and maybe in some instances not taken in account as much as what can be observed at the biological level. The last one is, at least in our country, there are other countries which behave differently, is that when we, and France has developed beautiful advances in the treatment of some neurodegenerative diseases, deep implants in the brain for treating Parkinson's disease and other diseases are the work from French researchers. But we have a tendency, when we cannot cure, to let people alone. And so in neurology, maybe more than in other settings, because when mental capacity or deep handicaps are involved, it's a binary situation. When you can treat, even not completely, you do everything that you can. And when you cannot treat, it's like the person cannot be considered as another, as oneself. And so I think one of the, if we go from a bench to the clinic and from clinic to society, one of the big problems is how do we consider people, others, as oneself, even when we cannot alleviate their troubles or their problems. And there is something very peculiar in the fact that because we cannot alleviate their suffering, in fact, we have a tendency to do nothing. So beside the study, beside everything that we can bring to help the person, I think that the first, maybe, and more in neurology and psychiatry than in other fields, maybe of medicine, the first thing is being there and allowing the person as best as he or she can and as we can to continue to be an I to whom we say you in an us, and not, as we have often tendency, to isolate the persons with other persons which are in the same case and not allowing them to live with us. And maybe this is, I always find a very nice that what we call by another name in French, languages are polysemic, is called in English care. We care for people in medicine. And to care for people in English is to care for somebody beyond the field of medicine. If I care for somebody, it means I consider this person as being important in my eyes. And so maybe one of the questions when studying, trying to understand, trying to be able to intervene, and trying to cure, is to ingrain all these approaches in an approach based on the care, which might be one of the most difficult approaches when some neurological or psychiatric diseases happen. In France, for example, a lot of people with psychiatric disorders, big psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, for example, are either in the street, homeless, or in prison. We were very stunned when we made an opinion at the French National Ethical Committee about health and medicine in prison to see that a very significant percentage of people with schizophrenia were incarcerated. And we thought that incarceration might not be the best way to help people with schizophrenia, and might be also something quite violent to people which don't have schizophrenia, because it's like for those who don't have schizophrenia, it's like being incarcerated in a psychiatric hospital. And so this tendency when we cannot do something to either do nothing or, or put somewhere, and psychiatric diseases are often frightening, which leads to incarceration. But mental handicaps, which are not frightening, lead more to isolation or living alone than this fear reaction. So it's what I wanted to tell you about oneself as another, and I'm sure there are a lot of other thoughts and ideas that could be built on this approach. Thank you very much.
It's a superb talk. Thank you, Jean-Claude. So, Joe.
Thank you for your brilliant talk. Many of us came back to Paris just to hear you talk again. So thank you so very much. Could you maybe elaborate more on the reciprocity notion and narrative in the context of Jacques Lacan's work and the relationality and the way language becomes the vector for the therapeutic psychoanalytic relationship between the analyst and the analysand, and how it happens sort of in that space in between. So could you say more about Lacanian psychiatry and notions of reciprocity?
Thank you. I'm not a specialist of Lacan, and I'm not a specialist of psychoanalysis. So for me, the interesting part of psychoanalysis, the interesting part of the Freudian revolution, is to have put at the center, for different reasons, the world of the person. And this, I think, was something very revolutionary, which means not only looking from the outside, but hearing what people have to say. And if you go to the WHO definition of health, which is often criticized by being said to be excessive, but a lot of good wishes are excessive. We have as a motto for our republic: liberty, fraternity, equality, and we see every day that we are not at this stage. So that the definition by WHO, as you know, is despite the absence of disease, a state of well-being, physical, mental, and social, which I think is interesting. The interesting part is not only social, because it means that it goes beyond the realm of medicine. In fact, it says in some way that medicine by itself cannot resolve all problems, or medicine should be in charge of the society, which would not be very good, so it should speak with others in other realms. But what the WHO says is well-being, and well-being cannot be defined from the outside. I can see how person behave, I can see his biological or other concept. I cannot see from the outside whether and even by brain imagery, I cannot see what other people feels well. And so I think this health definition says something about the role in medicine and the role in health of listening to the people. We cannot know what they think and how they feel if we not don't listen. So psychoanalysis, Freud's approach in this sense was interesting. What strikes me often, because it's what you do when you make of something an object of science, is that I'm not sure that psychoanalysis really listens to what somebody is saying. Okay, it's trying to understand once again invariants, patterns, hidden patterns in what is said. But the fact of expressing oneself might, whatever is done about what the person is doing, have this capacity of reappropriation. And so I think that the idea that narrating something about oneself has a therapeutic value because it allows you to reappropriate your identity is important. Now, there are a lot of ways I spoke about theater. Psychoanalysis is a strange kind of dialogue, okay, because it's more a monologue to which somebody is listening. And I think that speaking to somebody which will answer, which is a dynamic relationship, is not the same as speaking when somebody is listening. So I think there are a lot of variations about how do we build a narrative that has this kind of well-being virtue, and I would think that multiplying and diversifying the ways that narratives can be built may be the best solution, because I'm sure there is no, for different people, there are different ways of reconstructive narration. And for some people it might be very important to be heard by a lot of people, or to be in a dialogue, or to have the distance of writing and being read. So I think the value of what is called today, which I didn't mention, but which you know, narrative medicine, okay, which means before narrative was anamnesis. I need you to speak so that I know what happened to you. But it's an objective data. It's not because I'm interested in what you are saying for the value of what you are saying. It's because I need to know things which will be important to treat you. Narrative medicine says that narration is part of medicine, despite and independently of what I can learn as a physician about what is narrated and about the person. And sorry for Lacan.
If I may just add something, coming back to the locked-in syndrome that you described. If you look at the patient with locked-in syndrome, you cannot say anything about what he's thinking. Okay? But in addition to narration, I would add also observation, individual observation. Because if you look at the face of someone, if I look at your face just now, I can see, you see, I can guess who you are. No?
No, yes, okay. Which was alluding to, but it's not sure, you know, I can learn a lot about another as oneself by looking, by hearing, by touching, by everything, by imagery, whatever. The fact that the other thinks he's taken into account as an I is different. Because I can read your emotion, but you don't know it. I do something about it, which is nice, but you have no idea that I've taken you into account as an I.
I agree. Okay. Paul.
So,
Paul Ford.
You've said many things that many reflections that I find fascinating. It's interesting you highlighted the English use of medical care, and there's a kind of irony that no matter what I do to help with trainees, oftentimes when they mean they're at the end of life, they're going to withdraw treatment, they talk about withdrawing care then. So it has this opposite kind of negative connotation. Your focus is nicely on this relationship between the patient and the treating physician. I was a little surprised when you talked about the free choice and free and informed choice, that when those that have an impairment in their ability to choose, you jump to ethics committees, society, but it's my experience watching physicians, oftentimes the physician is interacting with almost an I to we of the patient and their loved ones and their partners, that's a very rich environment to think about the autonomy and the selves that are already networked across the table from the physician. And that I wondered if you had more comment about not the one-to-one I, you, I, thou, but rather this I to we, or this multiple I to thous all in one visit, and how that might have a different kind of autonomy than a singular kind of isolation.
Thank you. What you are saying about withdrawal of care, when we worked for 2 years now on end-of-life ethical questions in France, we were very surprised that even in the law, it's written about withdrawal of care, which in French is called soin. And there is a confusion between treatments that can or not be withdrawn and care, which should be the I don't know how you say in English, the socle, but the basis on which everything is done. And so the idea of stopping care is really like walking out of the room and saying, I don't know. So I think the confusion between cure and care, between treatment and care, is very much ingrained, and it's true in France also. I didn't speak about another, if I refer to Paul Ricoeur again, which is very important. You and me, oneself and another, can enter in a relationship where pressure can be exerted, where violence can be exerted, where instrumentalization can be exerted, even in the best intention. And so Ricoeur said, which is obvious, that this oneself and another should be regulated by just institutions. So you should have a mediation. Okay? This mediation can be institutions like ethics committee, like other committee. But if we go in the way of thinking of Amartya Sen in the idea of justice, we would say that, or he would say, that this regulation should be exerted by reasoned interaction between people. And so there is this idea that, in fact, society, social groups, should be mediators in addition to institutions in the relationships. And so the more people are involved, and the more it's living, changing, and possibly interesting, because there are many possible configurations. Now, since the end of the 80s, since AIDS, patients' associations have done a lot for this, because before, physicians had associations. A physician was never alone. He had colleagues, he had societies, and the patient was alone with somebody which was alone or not alone. Since the time of patient association, the idea is that the patient also is alone without being alone. And besides these associations which are professional or based on similarity, I think that every mediation which has a collective component brings life to this relationship with, once again, just institution which can make mediation, because groups can also exert instrumentalization or pressures as well as isolated individuals. So this idea of reasoned debate is something that allows, how to say, not to frozen this relation, the principle on which they are built, but to make it an emerging process. I could have, it would have been a little bit long. There is a view of Paul Ricoeur, if I stay on Paul Ricoeur, which I like very much, which is, he said that one time that one enters into ethics when, in addition to the expression by oneself of his or her freedom, one adds the will that the freedom of the other be. And he was adding, I want you to be free. And this is interesting. Why, in relation to what you are saying, because for him, the freedom of one didn't stop where the freedom of the other begins, which is one of the usual views of freedom. The freedom of one dependent on the freedom of the other. And so in some way, freedom is something that is a co-construction, an emerging, co-evolving process. And I think that in this kind of relationships between a patient and a physician, between a patient and a researcher, between associations, between families, and the fact that it's considered as an evolving and emerging process where each one needs or requires the input of the other is something which is very interesting. Once again, if there is some kind of arbitration and of mediation or of institution that can be sure from the outside that it's not going in a direction which might be detrimental to some of the people.
Yes, please. It should work. It doesn't. Okay. It's dead already.
Oh, I wanted to thank you for emphasizing on the care approach, and I wanted to ask you maybe if you could precise and develop some parts of your talk. First, on the care question, I wanted to know whether you are talking about caring about something, caring for something, or in the John Toronto's meaning of caring with we've been discussing, which is based on her book, Caring Democracy, the idea that the citizens are caring for democracy and democracy is caring for them. And we had in the last panel, which was really interesting, so maybe the panelists will add something. We had a very nice case with the Fragilics. We discussed the case of the grandfather whose I think Alexandre Radieux had a very nice slide on this. A grandson, Antoine, I think, was diagnosed with Fragilics, and we were discussing the case of the grandfather, who is now sick, and the issue was whether he should get the information or not, knowing that he cannot be cured. And we were discussing the issue to know whether we should give him the information or not, and the problem is who can decide this. And if we wonder how to think about other people and oneself as another and another as oneself, the issue is that we cannot decide for him. And we cannot know if he is himself right now because he is sick. So I'd like maybe if we just could get some more information from the panelists, and maybe with what you said we could discuss this case and have your point of view on that. It would be, I think, very interesting.
I'm sorry.
We had a 2 hours discussion about this case.
I'm
you could complete it from another point of view, so it could be interesting.
I'm sorry that I could not participate and I missed the meeting until now. I think there are several questions in what you are asking. Does a free informed process, a participation in a free informed process, be beneficial for him? Okay. This is a question of being in a process of choosing or deciding. Now, the question of informations that you get with no potential to change something is a completely other question, even in people which have no mental or psychological inabilities. To what extent knowing something that I cannot avoid is something which is a service which is rendered to me, or is a disservice which is rendered to me? So the first thing is, do I want to know, if they happen to be known, bad things that happen to me? Or do I prefer not to know, if somebody knows them, bad things that may happen? And this would be the first part of the process. And it could be on something else, which means if participating in an information, I choose, which is an informed choice, that I prefer not to know things that would be bad in whatever domain that there are. Or if I would like, for whatever reason, to know things, is the beginning of the process. Now, would I like to know things which might be good or bad, and on which I have no influence, which will not change the way I can have to make them happen or not? And this process, I would say, is something which may have autonomy value. You expand your autonomy without being centered from the beginning on, do you want to know what we know precisely on your case? Okay, so I would say, can we help the person tell us whether this kind of information would be something that would be seen by the person as useful or not? If we cannot determine it, maybe the best thing is not to give an information when we have no indication of how it would be taken. If we can progress on this way, we can then, I would say, reflect on it from another perspective. But I think there are two, the question of informations which are bad and that you cannot change is really the difference between prediction and prevention. And the question of whether prediction in medicine is something which is a service or an omen is something which is very complex. And the best answer we have found today is if we can see that a person prefers knowing it, we'll do it. And if we see a person prefers not to know it, we will not do it. And I think that even for children and for people with mental or psychological problems, it can be initiated as a process, even if the process at the end does not allow us to see if it would be a disservice or a service. It's the first thing that I can tell you. Care, yes, care for somebody, care with somebody. In fact, in a democracy, in principle, we postulate that we care for each other because we postulate that we should collectively make the choices. So we postulate that everybody has an equal part and an equal value in collective decisions. So it's caring for, it's caring with, it's very, I think it's a very nice question because it's very hard. If you care for and you don't care with, in fact, in some way you exclude the person because it speaks about you and not about a reciprocal, it's reciprocity. The same as my freedom depends on your freedom and your freedom depends on my freedom. It's a reciprocity which really makes oneself as another and the other as oneself. If it's only about me, it can be very generous, but it's beyond this point.
Jean-Claude, you gave really a marvelous talk, and I think we are very grateful that you have been able to come. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you to you.